Thank you, Giuseppe, and thank you for the invitation. It's really nice to see such a full room of a diverse audience interested in degrowth. So today I'll take, maybe this actually kind of bridges the gap to the last question there, where we saw a bit of action, and the larger degrowth discourse. I will walk us through a paper that my supervisor and I co-led that came out last year that involves quantitative modeling of degrowth proposals, degrowth scenarios for the global land and food system. And here we have a specific focus on climate mitigation, climate change mitigation, greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so maybe this is familiar to many of us in the room. Maybe it's new for some. The kind of jumping off point for this project were some common critiques of economic growth. So the first one is that despite continuous GDP growth, poverty persists, social welfare indicators are not improving, et cetera. And this GDP growth becomes increasingly decoupled from life satisfaction. So to put it bluntly, we earn more money, but we don't get happier. And of course, this expectation of infinite future economic growth is dependent on exploitation and accumulation of natural resources, causes a whole lot of pollution, and eventually we meet limited resources planetary boundaries. And here comes a classic neoclassical economist counter-argument that, well, we can make things more efficient, we can get more growth for less inputs and less pollution, and we can just have better technology. Well, yes, but one strong point for this, green growth perspective is that this decoupling between growth and resource usage, when it is observed in the recent history, which is actually very rarely for very little countries, and it's depending on how you account for exported emissions, et cetera. But when it's observed, it's happening far too slowly to meet important goals that we as a society have set, such as the Paris Accord for 1.5 degrees Celsius, such as biodiversity goals. So with this in mind, the kind of work that my team and actually a lot of my institute does are these long-term scenarios for the kind of Earth system. And what do I mean by scenarios? By scenarios, I mean possible futures, potential futures, plausible futures that we can end up in if certain types of actions are taken, and what this means for climate change impacts, what this means for societal changes, what this means for human welfare, basically. And these are what kind of feeds into a large chunk of the IPCC reports, for instance. So up until, especially when we started this project, there were very few degrowth climate mitigation scenarios modeled, and our project was also kind of an explicit response to commentaries, papers such as this one that say, because we've been modeling a lot of scenarios with infinite growth expected in there, this kind of constrains the futures that we imagine for ourselves. So by modeling other possible futures, we can kind of expand the imaginary space of potential futures. And another paper, this one was based on an energy system model that looks at how we can transform the energy system to meet 1.5 degrees with kind of degrowth principles. I work with the food and land system, so we were like, oh, why don't we test that out, quantitatively model some degrowth proposals for the land and food system. And I work with a model called, here a little digression into the type of modeling we do. It's called MAgPIE, Model of Agricultural Production and Its Impact on the Environment. There's the acronym. It's open source, so you could run it, we can all run it. And basically, It's an integrated land and food system model. By integrated, I mean we try to include all sorts of different data from, so biogeophysical climate impact data, so water availability, crop yields, heat effects, et cetera, at like the spatially explicit gridded global level, to socioeconomic data, so the price of food, the price of fertilizers, inputs, trade dynamics. And the model basically tries to meet, okay, well then things are driven by certain model assumptions or projections. So population growth, as the questioner mentioned. If we have 10 billion people by 2050, how can we feed the world? GDP assumptions, so growth assumptions are a quite strong driver in this model. So we have those, and that's something we wanted to question, and then scenario assumptions. And basically the model tries to find a least cost path to, let's say, feed the world. Maybe this term least cost path is setting off warning bells for maybe some of us in the room, where, okay, if it's cheapest to deforest the Amazon, for instance, then the model just like does that and says, oh, there you go. Well, we can constrain the model by putting in, so policies, climate action goals, the current committed ones, like the NDCs, the MPIs that were set at the COPs, whatever, or otherwise we can have more, we can model how more radical policies or solutions could look like quantitatively in the future. And there's a lot more other dynamics that we try to include in this model that we won't go into, but basically we can look at things like greenhouse gas policies, food transformation and production costs, land conversion, et cetera. So that's how that works, and let's get into the results. So we tested a few different scenarios of like what if possible futures for the land and food system, and the main actually like output that we were curious for this project is greenhouse gas emissions. This is greenhouse gas emissions from the food and land sector for the world. That's what we're looking at. And this line is basically the business as usual future. So from the recent past to 2100, this is if no new policies or if only those policies that are already committed are in place, if people keep in the same nutritional consumption paradigm as we are right now, this is business as usual. And we see that emissions basically don't fall. They rise until the second half of the century and then go down a little bit, but this is far from what we need if we want to meet the Paris Accord, for example. There's a study that says that just the food and land system itself can already blow past the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. So this is far from good. We include then actually a green growth scenario, because this is actually the predominant paradigm within kind of the modeling that we do. And a lot of the IPCC scenarios, for example, are based on kind of green growth ideas of improved technology and improved efficiency. So here, I talk about efficiency. I mean efficiency, as we just discussed, about more output per input, but I also talk about efficiency in terms of efficient pricing. So here we use a price on greenhouse gases to internalize the externalities. So it becomes, as Jakob also said, we can't really blame the conventional farmers, right? They are doing something that they're kind of compelled to do by the current system. So this kind of pricing incentivizes different behaviors, different technologies that are less polluting, because the pollution also has a cost now for these producers. So this is kind of the green growth scenario. We internalize the externalities, and we do see a drop, not a great drop, but we do see a change in emissions. And something to keep in mind here is that the business as usual and the green growth scenario are also driven by food demand, what people want to eat, by consumption patterns, by material like biomaterial demand and things like that, and all that changes as people get richer with increasing GDP. So let's take a look at the GDP projection that's driving these scenarios, and that looks pretty exponential, right? So we are about here, and this is the global average income per person per year. So in 2025, the average person in the world is making about 15,000 US dollars a year. In the Netherlands, it's about 57,000. I looked this up last night. Germany is about 50,000. And so this just keeps on increasing for a conventional kind of future scenario analysis. And so we thought, wow, that's really exponential. Why don't we put a cap on it? Why don't we change this dynamic so that maybe the potential future we have also ends up different. The emissions end up different. So we chose a cap at around 12,500 US dollars down here. And we chose that not arbitrarily, but because some studies show that this level is the amount at which happiness stops, kind of just saturates. Welfare, life satisfaction kind of saturates at this very low level of income. And this is kind of provided that other social services are, or common goods are provided for, such as healthcare and education, for example. But given that, we don't actually need so much, let's say, disposable income to be well off. And that might sound like a huge drop from 57,000 here to 12,000, and indeed it is. But for lower income regions in the world, that's what it looks like. For lower income regions in the world, it doesn't change the growth trajectory. And there is, like, in terms of the colonial and global north, global south relations in degrowth, there is a certain right for lower income regions, for the global south, to keep on growing in order to meet, like, welfare indicators such as education. For high income countries, it is a steep drop. So with this kind of GDP driver, then we put it into the model and we look at what emissions look like. And let's go to that. Here's what we had before. And so the cap actually ends up with this, which is not great. And we were like, that's interesting. And then we were thinking, well, degrowth principles are also around fair redistribution of income, of earnings. So actually, we shouldn't just cap the income. We should also redistribute what is capped and taken away and transfer that to lower income regions, global south. We can think of this as international, like, adaptation fund transfers. We can think of this as climate reparations. So we do a scenario like that with redistribution, and then we end up with something like this. So it's like, and so we end up with this kind of result, and this is actually a particularity, or like a characteristic of the food system, of the current consumption patterns that people have in terms of what they want to eat. And the reason we end up with this is that even with a little bit of income, people start eating a lot more meat within the current nutrition transition. So maybe with such an income gap, you stop buying SUVs, but you don't really stop eating meat. And with a redistribution of income to lower income regions, and we can see this also in recent consumption patterns in China, for example, people start eating animal products almost right away as soon as countries get richer. And this is why we see results like this. And then we were like, okay, but is this really, let's say, degrowth scenario if the underlying structure of behavior of society doesn't change? So we thought harder about this, and then went back to some literature, read some more, and I liked this quote from this is a review published some years ago, that the degrowth perspective is focused on enhancing human well-being and then reducing the importance of economic growth in attaining this goal. So maybe it's a bit flipped from what was first posted, but then we were thinking maybe we put the cart before the horse, or whatever. And so we come up with a new scenario that is kind of more aligned with this, that is based on enhancing human well-being. And we know that this current food system is not sustainable for the planet, but nor is it sustainable for human health. The nutrition transition as it stands right now also leads to a lot of health impacts for people. So we came up with kind of a sufficiency-based scenario that is more centered around eat what you need. It's not actually completely vegetarian, it's maybe one meal of animal product per week, and is much more based around plant-based proteins and fruits and vegetables. So eat what you need. And this is what we call a degrowth sufficiency scenario. And then we end up with emissions trajectories that look like this purple one. And so that's even better than kind of the green growth idea that has been so predominant recently, where with a more or less simple shift in behavior and consumption patterns, we get very strong emissions reductions very quickly. So, and then we were thinking, okay, is this now a degrowth scenario really? Because we haven't really changed the drivers behind this. And so with the model as a partial equilibrium kind of economic model, we can look at the economic activity in the agricultural sector itself. So what is the amount of agricultural GDP that is going on in the ag sector? And this is business as usual. It keeps growing. With the green growth, we see even more economic activity as farmers need to invest in different technologies, less polluting technologies, and more activities taken on. And for the sufficiency one, actually, we see a very strong drop and then basically a stabilization of the economic activity in the agricultural sector. So the agricultural sector ends up not growing, the GDP ends up not growing because we first enhance human and planetary welfare. And this is for us much more in line with what kind of certain degrowth principles are about in terms of enhancing human and planetary well-being and then not really caring what happens to the economy or to GDP, let's say. So in this way, we like to say that this one is our true degrowth scenario. And finally, we realized that because we can look at things like at the affordability of food or the accessibility of food, we have this sufficiency diet, but for some segments, lower income segments in lower income regions of the world, it is actually not immediately affordable for people, accessible for people. So there's like a redistribution issue indeed. So then we combine the degrowth with the redistribution scenario, and then we wanted to see if there were certain synergies between our sufficiency one and kind of the efficiency one of the green growth. If degrowth already covers all the levers, or if there are further gains to be had if we combine efficiency into this. And so there we end up with a transformation scenario, we're calling it, that ends up actually with a net neutral, so zero emissions by the end of the century. There's a really steep decline, and then it just keeps going down. And we end up with net zero kind of as a lucky coincidence by 2100. So yeah, OK. So some take-home messages. Efficiency in the sense that we mean it also with efficient pricing and internalization of the costs, of the true costs of food, can go hand in hand with sufficiency practices. I think for the efficiency economists, they've always looked down on the sufficiency ones, but there's nowhere in degrowth that says, as Julia said, that that degrowth is anti-technology or and here technology, we can take it to mean also so agroecological technologies. The model does not really pick specific ones. And furthermore, maybe this is known to many of us here, but degrowth is a transformation, not a recession. So the first kind of imposed GDP change scenarios where maybe it can be seen as more of a top-down thing, but it's really the bottom-up change that happens. And here I want to highlight that even though we're modeling a diet change, I don't want to have this in your minds as okay, then all we need is individual behavior consumption changes. There's a lot of policies that can encourage and incentivize bottom-up changes in terms of maybe reducing the power of the livestock lobby, banning advertising for animal-based products, public provisioning of foods in schools and hospitals and universities that doesn't have to be meat-based. So all these kinds of things can kind of encourage this shift in societal behavior. Finally, this is what I mentioned with the prices of foods. Redistribution is necessary in terms of justice, also for the food and land system, but it's not absolutely sufficient for the kinds of climate change, sustainability changes that we want to see. And finally, This is related to the size of the agricultural economy. We saw that the agricultural economy for the world shrinks. And so this means there's less work in the future for agriculture. And agriculture is a main employer, especially in lower income regions. So this kind of brings up fair transition questions. This is an ongoing topic in my group. Or we potentially just work less in agriculture. Thank you very much.
I was already wondering where this was. Wow, so many hands. I think that one was first, I guess. So let's start from there. Name, affiliation, and please one question per person.
Thank you very much. This was super inspiring. My name is Marieke Leegwater. I work for Solidaridad. It's a civil society organization. My question is that the final scenario that you showed, I think, looks really, inspiring to many of us, and I think it can have a great attracting value if we are able to communicate about it. I was wondering, I personally find it super hard to imagine, are we really globally eating all enough? And can we be able to drive it down so much? Like, what do we eat? Is this for real? Or how? Or is this a strange question? I don't know, but
do you mean that like right now we're eating so much that it's so high, and then just from eating we can reduce it so much?
Well, if you show, let's say the scenario, the one where, where it goes down so. Can we, if we really do the green growth, redistribution, and degrowth, can we go down so much and all globally eat sufficiently? Like.
I mean, right. I mean, this diet is something that is like, this is not something we made up. It's also something that came from multiple studies that involve like environmental scientists combined with dietitians, nutritionists, and things like that to make up, it's called the Planetary Health Diet, that was made by a commission from Eat Lancet, whatever, from the Eat Lancet Commission. So, and there, it's a diet that is claimed to be good for the planet and for people. There has been some critique of this diet because it is not very flexible for different regions and cultural backgrounds. But in our model implementation, we do have like regionally specific like differences for what people eat, and there's ongoing work to make it less hegemonic. But I mean, yes. So. Something that happens with this big gap is that there are synergies that happen between this like green growth and this transformation, where and the sufficiency. So because we're eating so much less, I mean, animal products, you need so much land for feed that it frees up really a lot, and with kind of this incentivization of different practices, then there could be more natural land, there's more natural forestry that comes back, and that actually sucks some carbon emissions back down. And so that's why we get this really strong, even stronger decline for this combination of scenarios.
Thank you. Yeah. Super inspiring.
Very inspiring indeed, but do you have any thoughts about how do we reach that?
Yeah, right.
Because, well, just around the corner, people are rich and they eat healthy and they know about health foods. Just about the second corner, there's a complete other neighborhood where people earn very few money, and they actually live in the same city 7 years shorter. And that is because they eat too much fat and too much sugar. They move, they have a green environment as well, but they're eating the wrong things. Do you have any thoughts about how to reach this fantastic?
Yeah, I mean, as I quickly mentioned at the end, I think it's really first about also the social economic milieu really dictates kind of certain kind of consumption patterns. So I think it's often can be dangerous to tell people, oh, you're eating the wrong thing, when this is something that arises from conditions of, but of course there are policies that can encourage better eating, both for health and planet, which starts also maybe at a really early age in like schools where, oh, well, this is different ways to eat, or like CSA provisioning, or just, I mean, there needs to be so many different changes that allow for, like, as I said, showing that it can be possible to have a vegetarian meal at the university and still feel full or whatever, yeah.
Thank you. All the way back, and
Okay.
I know there are many who will love us.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I'm Eduardo. I'm assistant professor at the FU in Amsterdam. I will try to ask one question now, and then I can ask many other about justice later on. I'm thinking about the last scenario because green growth or growth and degrowth, they have logics that they don't talk to each other, right? They don't go hand in hand. So I'm wondering what are the assumptions that you have in your model about green growth in relation to the search and selection of technology? Because now in economics in general, of technology innovation, these are profit growth-based business models. So what kind of modeling assumptions you have in this scenario?
Yeah, so our model is a bit, let's say, technology agnostic. It has kind of, how would I say this? That's a really good question. Because it's a partial equilibrium model, so it can only really model the agricultural sector itself. And we can't really highlight specific types of technologies or investment strategies for this for the different scenarios. So we have like different investment costs for like changing the nitrogen efficiency of a plant or of fertilizers or things like that, but we only change the outcome, and we can't really say that this is the type of technology that is leading to this. We just say this is how much it costs to reduce nitrogen pollution by this much. So it's a bit abstracted away from maybe the actual on the ground business profit decisions that happen. Not that.
Yeah, I was the economist from.
Right, yeah. We can talk more about it, yeah.
Back, I brought it because I would have never got it.
Yeah. Hi, thanks very much. I'm Lucia Sobova from Wageningen University, and it's actually a clarification question. I got a bit lost when you talked about economic activity in agriculture. If you could explain how that was really measured.
Yeah.
And also this idea that the amount of work would decrease seems a bit counterintuitive. So if you could explain that a bit more.
So by economic activity in the agricultural sector, we can model like the different amounts of costs and inputs that need to go into producing food. So this is in terms of labor, this is in terms of capital, this is in terms of the inputs, the costs of the like inputs such as fertilizer, water, and so seeds and things like that go into the system, and we add up all these costs, and that is kind of the amount of activity that is going on. I mean, here we put it as a percentage, I guess, but sorry, yeah. So 2020 is just like 100% just as an index. But basically it's a dollar value that changes. And in terms of the amount of labor, so basically labor, like the amount of workers in the agricultural sector is kind of just a share of this total amount of economic activity. And if we assume that the shares don't change, then it would end up shrinking, right? So, but of course, if we shift to more vegetable intensive or more agroecological practices that are more labor dependent, then maybe this dynamic ends up different. And this is actually some ongoing work from a colleague of mine, but we couldn't say anything about that for this study.
Thanks.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. My name is Louis. I'm a Master of Sustainable Development here at Utrecht University. A question relating to the earlier comment about the assumptions. Maybe if you can move to that slide of the transformation scenario. So I am also of the opinion that there is, like it was stated, there are non-complementary logics behind green growth and degrowth. And like you said, this transformation scenario is technology agnostic. It doesn't point to specific technologies or measures that distinguish or show how they are complementing. So I wonder, isn't it a bit dangerous to use this scenario, for example, as a policy recommendation in which degrowth measures can be co-opted by more green growth paradigms, just because there is clearly a gap between a pure green growth and a pure degrowth measure. So how do you
Think you can throw it all the way?
all the way?
Perhaps
Just getting ready.
I'm scared.
Oh!
You wanted to ask a question? Yes? Okay.
Hi, my name is Rose. I'm a farmer and activist. And I actually had a question about the last take-home message about the role is because of fossil fuels. I was wondering to what extent fossil fuels are part of your predictions, and then to what extent, if you say there will be less work in agriculture, does that mean that there will still be labor exploitation? Because currently the capitalist food system is built on labor exploitation. It's either, and in a lot of alternative food systems, there's a lot of self-exploitation, and to what extent is that addressed?
Yeah, super great question. In terms of fossil fuels, that comes from another model. So like then we like combine the two models and then we can look at that, but we don't have it for now. So in this way, the scenarios that I've presented are also, let's say, agnostic. Of course, then we can say that this is part of a larger transition towards a sustainable degrowth world where the energy that is being used, whether it's for like a really capital intensive like machinery, whatever, that energy is coming from renewable energies or whatever. So that could be like part of the storyline, but I can't quantitatively say anything for this study from that. In terms of labor exploitation, that is also ongoing work. In this one, we just kind of just said, oh, that might, like as a like simple share, if it doesn't change, then that might just decrease. But you're absolutely right that alternative measures have like a ton of like exploitation and or self-exploitation. So there we now have like some model implementations that look at I mean, it's hard to define exploitation and then harder to put it into like a quantitative model. But we do have things now like minimum incomes and minimum like wages and things like that. That of course is still within kind of a capitalist understanding, but then at least we can define like based on living standards and incomes for workers. And like hours worked also, which is.
Is this an easy one?
Can you go back to the slide before this one? Yeah, I think this is on the same line as the previous question, but my concern is that within green growth, the political economy doesn't change from business as usual. So the economic side of the model, equilibrium clears, production matches supply, and the economy model works as intended. However, when you introduce some of these other assumptions, the political economy radically transforms. So like you're changing the so consumption preferences change. At the same time, we don't know necessarily if the production side of the model still functions as usual, because you're having distribution, you're having sufficiency, and you're adding all these other criteria that in the real world would be a dramatic transformation of the political economy. So to what extent can you even say these model results are valid anymore, because we are changing things beyond the fundamental assumptions of the model?
I would argue against that, in that all the model outputs are still economically sound, in that they still meet equilibriums and things like that. So they just meet whatever equilibria levels, but just at different levels. In that way, the political economy actually is harder for us to say anything, because there would be a whole lot of like policy implementations that would need to be implemented for such scenarios to happen. But technically they do, they are sound in terms of like the prices, in terms of the economic dynamics that are happening internally in the model. But the political economy to reach there is definitely the bigger question. Yeah.
We can take one or two more questions. Yeah, the back.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Lucy, I work as a project manager at Emden Local to Local, so focus on local food in the broadest term of its sense. And I had just a question more, I guess, broadly about degrowth being like you see in the model, like really requiring for a lot of political ambition and willpower. And I was wondering how you would see then, also back with the agroecology, regenerative agriculture movement also, there is a lot of overlap in the thinking of it, but then in the sense of, like we mentioned also before, with this agroecology, we offer direct grassroots solution that is also more connected to the people directly, while I feel like degrowth is more like a top-down approach to things. How would you say that these two movements can actually merge in and support each other, in the sense of, we have this bottom-up movement, and then the top-down that is there, degrowth, to then, push for more political ambition?
Maybe you should ask the political scientists in the room. But yeah, definitely, I mean, for us here, the degrowth idea is definitely trying to show that bottom-up change is needed on the consumer level, especially. And agroecological principles are also ongoing work, but very hard because there's such a diversity of practices to put into a very generalized level model like this, because we do global scale. So that's actually a very always an ongoing conversation of how can we be more specific with certain practices while still being able to run the whole thing or whatever, but being able to have something general enough for the world, right? So there, I mean, of course, I would also love to have an agroecology scenario for the supply side that then complements kind of the demand side degrowth, which is happening at the consumer level, to then have these combined. And that's, I'm working on on a local food kind of implementation that tries to look at, how far away do we need to meet people's food supplies, and then if they change dietary patterns, then maybe it's easier or something like that. So that's also something I'm working on. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
The very last question was up there.
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Stan. I'm a student, a master's student at Wageningen University. And I was wondering, you were talking about pricing and equilibria in your model. And I was wondering how you deal with carbon pricing if the model relies heavily on discounting the future, and also how you see the integration of the loss of biodiversity, for example, from agricultural practices, and how you would envision dealing with the many issues that pricing that might have.
In terms of the carbon price, we use a specific carbon price that is derived from other calculations that try to include the social cost also, and we use actually quite a high carbon price that tries to enforce like as strong a change. This green growth one is actually with actually a very high carbon price because we wanted to kind of test the limits of green growth versus, let's say, degrowth. So there, I wouldn't say that discounting has made this price like non-relevant for what is being presented here. And sorry, what was the second bit?
The way in which you envision, for example, integrating biodiversity loss and pricing that.
There's, my colleague published a nice paper on that where we look at biodiversity, and because biodiversity is on such a fine scale, but we now, I feel like every answer I'm giving is ongoing work, but we now have like more, so better representations of downscaling the agricultural practices into actually, he does like 2 meter by 2 meter scale or something, or 200 meter, I don't know. Then there we can look at like pollinator biodiversity and things like that, or we also have certain implementations in already of protecting certain areas that are biodiversity rich. So kind of by default, those are not gone, like those areas are left as natural land and not allowed for land conversion, for instance. So there are certain like safeguards that are already in there. Yeah. Thank you.